Hello there everyone, I am your host, the Sea Monster, and for this video, which I will let you all know ahead of time isn't going to be my most heavily edited video in terms of visuals, I want to discuss a talking point, open up a conversation perhaps, in regards to the Godzilla franchise, more specifically a talking point that is perpetuated by a certain renowned content creator. But first, I would like to start by going over some facts/trivia that will shortly become relevant. For the uninitiated, champagne is a sparkling wine that originated in the Champagne wine region of France. That's just a day's drive away from Paris, invented by Dom Perignon. The following statements are direct quotes/paraphrasings from the webpage for Le Grand Cottage. All champagne is sparkling wine, but not all sparkling wine is champagne. It's also been stated and accepted, especially amongst the circles which Le Grand Cottage aligns with, that champagne is to be thought of in terms of geographical location as opposed to just a winemaking style. For all products produced even 10 feet outside the Champagne region, it must be legally called sparkling wine in other areas of the world. For instance, sparkling wine that is made from grapes that are grown in the United States can only be referred to by law as sparkling wine, no matter the types of grapes that are used or the methods in which the wine is made. There's also the matter of champagne coming to a higher price point than sparkling wine, but that's an aside compared to the primary point in this case, which is that champagne can only legally be called champagne so long as it's made in a specific part of France. End of trivia session. Now, let's get into the meat of things, shall we? James Rolfe, the founder of Cinemassacre, who is commonly associated as the star and creator of the iconic web series The Angry Video Game Nerd, stated in a video of his back in 2016 when the first trailer for Shin Godzilla, which at the time was known to the US as Godzilla Resurgence, was released, that at the time it was the first real Godzilla movie in 12 years since the release of Godzilla Final Wars back in 2004. Now some of you may be wondering, wait a minute, what does he mean by real Godzilla movie? Isn't Godzilla 2014 a Godzilla movie and that came out 2 years before Shin? If so, what would constitute 2014 as not a real Godzilla movie, while Shin would constitute as a real one? Well, my friends, the following, which I am about to quote from Rolfe himself, is why we're here. Rolfe goes on to say that in order for a Godzilla movie to be deemed as a real Godzilla movie, it simply has to be made in Japan by Toho. It's like champagne. Anybody can make their own and call it champagne, but unless it's from Champagne, France, it's not champagne. Also, Godzilla needs to be an actor in a rubber suit. There could be some CG enhancements to the suit, which is what they're doing, as in what they're doing in Shin Godzilla, but as long as there's some actual physical monster acting happening in front of the camera, it counts. In the case of Shin Godzilla, it was a man in a mocap suit, but let's just assume that at the time he didn't really know that that was the case. Also, as a side note, this isn't just a perspective that he held back in the day but no longer stands by. He's held this position even to now, seemingly, such as when he reiterates his position on what makes an authentic Godzilla movie, sans the champagne analogy, in his review for Godzilla -1. Okay, so to James himself, I'm a fan of your work. Mainly your past work as the AVGN from the mid-2000s to somewhere around the mid-2010s, around that general area, as well as your initial lineup of Cinemassacre's Monster Madness. I have an immense level of respect and appreciation for you as a content creator, and how your content has helped shape not just my love, understanding, appreciation, and so on for the films which I am a fan of, but also just filmmaking in general. I've even supported your decision to boycott the absolute dumpster fire and a half that was Ghostbusters 2016 in the wake of all the controversy surrounding it, in order to highlight the older films instead, which are vastly superior, by the way, And as a result, I gained even more respect for you for sticking to your guns despite the backlash. So yes, James, Mr. Rolfe, sir, I consider you to be a bit of an influence for how I conduct my expressions for my passion for cinema, whether it's reviews / critiques on films or even home movies of my own. And for that, I thank you. That being said, boy howdy do I have things to say about your perspective on Godzilla media being akin to champagne. Now, back in the day when I had a YouTube channel titled G4784, I posted a comment on either James's trailer video for Shin Godzilla or possibly his and Mike Matei's review on Shin Godzilla itself when it finally had its limited theatrical run in the US in October of 2016, that while I may stand by certain portions of what I said, I do wish I had refined a bit more on it and done a better job at expressing what I wanted to say back then, because I did catch some heat for it about my apparent lack of understanding in the matter of champagne or wine in general. That being said, I've been refining how I could express the point of my old, now non-existent comment of mine over time, and I think that's rather fitting to consider it as akin to something like wine, or champagne perhaps, that has only aged better throughout the years because new developments within the time frame between then and now can help bolster my point more than any off-the-cuff response ever could. And so, I think now seems to be a good time to finally challenge James's idea regarding champagne and Godzilla, as it's deserved. So with that said, let's get started. First, the point regarding Toho and the direct comparison itself between Godzilla and champagne. This one is going to be a little more straightforward, as James isn't 100% incorrect here. Sure, there is something to be said about how much of an event a Godzilla film would be if it were to come directly from Toho and from Japan exclusively, and especially if it was distributed internationally. Godzilla 2000, while not a financial hit in the US by any stretch of the imagination when it came out there, was definitely a big deal amongst many Goji fans from the land of stars and stripes, especially in light of the overwhelming disappointment that was the result of Godzilla 1998. Same can be said for the likes of Godzilla -1, though that film has certainly seen a significantly greater and even unprecedented level of success for a Japanese Godzilla film released in international markets. But here's the thing. Yes, Godzilla 2000, Shin Godzilla, and -1 all come directly from Japan, whereas the likes of the MonsterVerse films do not. However, the hole in James's champagne analogy in this particular regard is that champagne can only legally be deemed as champagne if it comes from the Champagne region in France. Otherwise, it cannot be legally counted or endorsed as such. It's been universally considered that way. Toho gave the likes of Legendary Pictures, Warner Brothers, and even Sony at the time the legal right to make Godzilla movies, and those studios had Toho's endorsements to make those movies as such. Whether the films that came as a result of this legal approval were ultimately disavowed by Toho or welcomed with open arms, the American Godzilla films were legally allowed by Toho and all the rest to be considered as Godzilla films, not just by having the name Godzilla in their titles, but because the character, the IP, was used by those studios that were legally allowed to do whatever they wished for their respective projects, so long as the character even vaguely resembled the general design that is recognizable as Godzilla. Basically, what I want to make clear is that whereas champagne has to be legally deemed as champagne based on a specific, clearly defined set of requirements, James's requirements for a Godzilla film to be quote-unquote authentic doesn't hold up when we bring Toho's legal endorsement of certain projects into the equation. So we've gone over the first part of James's analogy, which has already been shown to be built on a pretty faulty foundation, all things considered. Now, let's get into the other part, which is where it really starts to fall apart. In his Shin Godzilla trailer video, he states that Godzilla 2014, as he puts it, never felt official to him, because it didn't come directly from Toho, which is true since it was Legendary that produced the film and subsequent MonsterVerse films from then on, as well as stating that Godzilla was completely CG. Considering his point that an actor in a suit with CG enhancements, i.e. a mocap suit, would also count, in which Shin Godzilla does fit the bill, at least in James's estimation, to where he even says as such, despite the film scrapping the initial plan of having an animatronic Goji suit. That would be a fair point if Godzilla in 2014 was completely CG. But he wasn't. TJ Storm performed mocap as Godzilla in Godzilla 2014, and he would go on to do the same in Godzilla King of the Monsters 2019, in a similar vein that the likes of Andy Serkis would go on to play Gollum in the Lord of the Rings saga, which also includes the character's appearance in The Hobbit and Unexpected Journey. In the case of KOTM, there was also Jason Liles, Alan Maxson, and Richard Dorton, who all each played an individual head of King Ghidorah, with Liles also doing performance capture acting, which is another term for mocap acting, for Rodan in the same movie. Even Godzilla vs. Kong, despite not featuring any performance capture acting for Godzilla or Mechagodzilla, as they were both entirely CGI in that particular instance, still featured such performing for Kong, as portrayed by Eric Peaty. Granted, at least as of this video's release, until we get confirmation down the line, it's unclear as to whether or not there will be mocap acting at play for Godzilla Kong the New Empire, even with the consideration of how many simian-like titans there are present in that film. Not just Kong included. But the point still stands, with the point being that 2014, and by extension KOTM and GVK, does in fact count as a real Godzilla movie by James's own standards on that front. I also want to point out that James has been on record to be harsher towards 2014, which featured an actor in mocap, and KOTM, which featured several actors in mocap, than GVK, which had as many mocap actors in 2014 and less than KOTM upon its initial run. Just a thought. And we certainly have to conclude that James has a great deal of respect for mocap acting, because he's even cited Andy Serkis for his performances as Gollum in the Lord of the Rings trilogy and Caesar in the Planet of the Apes films. So by James's metric, he should at least be fair to mocap acting that's been done for a Godzilla movie, whether it's Shin Godzilla or Godzilla 2014. Even someone like myself who likes GVK, sorry Cinemassacre, I find that bit of trivia to be quite interesting given the context of this discussion, as perhaps there may be an inconsistency at play in regards to James's standards. Again, just a thought. But wait, there's more. James Rolfe considers Godzilla 1998 to be not Godzilla, such as he stated in his video for Godzilla 1998 for his Godzilla-thon series, due to how Zilla bears little resemblance to the King's classic traditional look and doesn't fit the requirements, i.e. breathing atomic fire and being indestructible. But, by James's standards in his Shin Godzilla trailer video, he says that a Godzilla film can only be authentic if it's made by Toho and if Godzilla was an actor in a suit, CG enhancements or otherwise. We already gone over that Godzilla 98 was legally endorsed by Toho at the time, in order for it to be greenlit and made, regardless of how it turned out or what even came of it. Not only that, but Zilla in 1998 actually was performed, even if to a certain extent, by a physical actor in a suit. An uncredited actor named Kurt Carley, There were even practical effects involved with Godzilla 1998, not just with the destroying of buildings, but also even with Zilla himself, which Carly operated in. James even addresses that in his review in Godzilla Minus One. But now, that brings us to another rather damning point regarding James's POV and what makes an authentic Godzilla film, as well as his champagne analogy. And this particular bit is going to be real juicy, let me tell you. On November 30th, 2023, Graham Skipper of Fangoria.com interviewed Godzilla Minus One director Takashi Yamazaki and asked him whether Godzilla in that film was done through mocap or if he was all CGI. Yamazaki responds by saying that his film featured no instance of mocap, but rather Godzilla was rendered as a completely CG creation from the ground up, with the director, who also wrote and did the VFX for the film, giving his animators visual references via physical gestures primarily with his hands, just to give them an idea or reference for what they are trying to render. So in short, no mocap acting whatsoever. And guess what, folks? James Rolfe, in his review/first impressions vid on Minus One, where he makes a similar point to his champagne argument about how an authentic Godzilla movie has to exclusively come from Japan, he deemed Minus One as the best in the franchise. Now he also says in that same review that the American Godzilla films, more specifically the MonsterVerse films, have been missing a certain ingredient that can only come from the source. But he doesn't specify what that ingredient is. If the ingredient is that it has to have themes that are relatable or comprehensible to the people of Japan, then that would go against the champagne argument, because that argument isn't about how the wine/film is made or what it is used to make it, but rather where the product comes from specifically. Anybody could literally put in themes or storytelling that could be comprehensible or relatable to a particular audience, and do that in just about any other country except where said country which they're trying to relate to even came from. So that just defeats the champagne argument right then and there. If the ingredient that is missing in the MonsterVerse films but is present in the likes of Minus One is that the Godzilla film has to have an actor in a suit, CG enhancements or otherwise, then by James's logic here, Godzilla 2014, KOTM, GVK, and even Godzilla 98 fit the bill, but Minus One shouldn't. Yet Minus One is still considered by James as an authentic Godzilla film, even though his criteria for what constitutes a Godzilla film being authentic or real is that it has to be from Japan, from Toho, and that it has to feature an actor in a suit. And if James's criteria that ties into his champagne analogy for what makes for an authentic Godzilla movie is that the film has to fall into at least one of the two categories of said criteria, if that's what he is implying, then that would mean that every Godzilla film ever made would count as real or authentic by that logic. And so we may as well just throw the champagne analogy and all the rest out the window entirely, because there would just be no point in trying to distinguish one Godzilla film as authentic and the other as not. So, at this point, we may as well just go ahead and say that James Rolfe's criteria for this case, in regards to his champagne analogy, just has too many holes to make for a compelling enough case for why one Godzilla film should be deemed as a more worthy entry than another, or rather more authentic or real, as one may put it. I would say the more substantial and more compelling case that could be made for a Godzilla movie compared to another is whether that one is good and the other is not quite as good, but that's beside the point. Now, one last thing before we start to close this out, just so we can ease things down a bit. Look, I'm not here to attack James Rolfe or to say that he is a lesser Godzilla fan. Far from it. He's still a Godzilla fan, by and large, and we as a fan base should still welcome him for his love and appreciation for the character and for the franchise that has proven to be genuine, honest, true, whatever word in a similar vein one may wish to describe him. I even understand that how one may perceive what would make an authentic Godzilla movie can fall into the category of subjectivity, and James may very well have signposted that notion, if not by direct confirmation, then by mere implication. It's just that I cannot really, in good conscience, say that his champagne analogy regarding Godzilla should be something that we should really take note of or go off on, just based on what we've gone over this past video. And with as much popularity and as much of a reach as he does have, I have to conclude that his champagne analogy is very flawed because it's built on standards that contradict themselves and are too hazy to be well defined, and despite my channel's relatively minuscule size, I do hope that I've shed a ray of much needed light onto some fundamental issues that could potentially poison the well in terms of how Godzilla media is discussed down the line. Perhaps his analogy as established in 2016 isn't the same as it is now. It's entirely possible. In fact, I would love it if he were to make a video that would better explain his position regarding this analogy, but at the same time, I'll certainly understand if he's just simply too busy to even be made aware of videos like mine that are trying to call his champagne analogy into question, whether it's with his AVGN content or Cinemassacre content in general, or stuff in his personal life. Nonetheless, one can only hope and wonder, and until something comes up, that's all I can really do as of this moment. And with that said, I think it's time that we call it a video and start making our merry way to closing it all out. I'd like to thank you all very much for watching, and I hope you all find this video to be worthwhile, or I hope at least I didn't come off as a big meanie to James Rolfe here, as such a thing was never my intention, but rather I wanted to open up a discussion regarding his Godzilla and champagne analogy, and do so in a more in-depth manner so as to break it down, to try to understand it, and to see where it can be improved more or less. If James does happen to be watching this and has made it this far, then I would like to personally give him a shout out and a huge thanks for checking me out and taking the time to at least hear me out. And as far as future content of mine is concerned, I will be sure to signpost it and give you all the heads up on what's to come. Once again, thanks for watching, and until my next video or series of videos, I will see you all later.